Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Phantasmagoria, a third-person point-and-click adventure title, developed and published by Sierra Online for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms in 1995, with an eventual port to the Sega Saturn as a Japanese exclusive title in 1997. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 149. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Phantasmagoria. Phantasmagoria is a third-person point-and-click adventure title, developed and published by Sierra Online for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms in 1995, with an eventual port to the Sega Saturn as a Japanese exclusive following in 1997. Before we can talk about Phantasmagoria, we need to take a step back to talk about the game's creator, Roberta Williams, the person who, in the eyes of many, is effectively the grandmother of the entire graphical adventure game genre. Roberta and her husband Ken Williams are legitimate royalty in the computer and video game space, as both built online systems and later Sierra Online into one of the behemoths of the entire gaming industry. Over the 80s and into the 90s, Sierra Online would become one of the most prolific game publishers in the world, though the company never forgot its origins, which were, namely, adventure games. Sierra Online's adventure game output would be nearly unmatched, with a cadre of game designers and development teams on staff that churned out hit after hit for the company. And in the process, Sierra would garner a significant number of fans, many of whom waited anxiously for any new Sierra adventure game release. If we take a look at the majority of Sierra's adventure game releases over the years, it's pretty easy to see that the company, for the most part, focused on delivering family-friendly entertainment for the majority of their titles. Sure, Sierra would dip their toes into more mature waters every now and then, primarily with the raunchy comedy series Leisure Suit Larry and the gritty police procedural Police Quest games, but for the most part, Sierra adventures were designed so that nearly anyone could pick up and play them. The actual games themselves might be fiendishly challenging or require significant leaps of logic to solve the various puzzles players may encounter, which might require a degree of cognitive maturity beyond what most children possess. But from a content perspective, Sierra adventures were, most of the time, designed for all ages to enjoy. At the same time, Sierra was a very large company, and Ken Williams was, first and foremost, a businessman who was always on the lookout for ways to maximize the company's profits. Up through the early 90s, that meant delivering family-friendly fare to gamers around the world, and nowhere was this more evident than in their flagship game franchise, King's Quest. King's Quest was the brainchild of Roberta Williams, and from 1984 through the early 90s, the King's Quest series was effectively synonymous with adventure gaming, with countless players enjoying the whimsical, fairy tale-inspired scenarios that made up each and every King's Quest release. And by extension, Roberta Williams herself would become known through her work on the King's Quest series, as well as other tangential efforts like the child-focused Mixed Up Mother Goose and the slightly more mature Laura Bow series, all of which would serve to make Roberta Williams a household name amongst adventure game players. While Roberta was designing and releasing games, Sierra as a company continued to grow, with one of its primary goals being to deliver cutting-edge entertainment that utilized the most advanced technologies and industry-leading game designs available. That's why, as CD-ROM technology began to become more prevalent, Sierra would begin releasing CD-ROM versions of their most popular titles, with augmented graphics, cutscenes, music, and voice acting serving to distinguish CD releases as more advanced than their floppy disk counterparts. It's also why, as the standards for voice acting in video games began to advance beyond amateur performance towards leveraging professional talent, Sierra would begin bolstering the voice casts for their games to include Hollywood actors like Tim Curry, Leah Remini, and Mark Hamill. And it's why, when full motion video began to become the it technology of the early to mid 90s, Sierra would spend over $1 million to build a brand new film studio in the hopes that they'd be able to deliver the interactive FMV experiences that other companies simply couldn't compete with. Now, I've relayed my personal opinion on FMV titles before, but I'm going to say it again. I am a huge fan of full motion video games. I know a lot of people complain about the lack of interactivity that many of these games feature, and a lot of people will complain about the fact that in many titles you're basically just watching a movie rather than playing a game a good chunk of the time. But regardless, when FMV first burst onto the scene, there was something truly magical about seeing real people on a computer screen. As most longtime listeners know, I grew up in the 80s playing video games, both in the arcades and on the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, and across nearly all of the titles that were available at the time, the predominant graphical style was purely pixel art and sprite-based, simply because the technology at the time couldn't really support much more than limited color palette pixel graphics. Sure, you had some exceptions to that rule, as certain arcade titles based on laserdiscs could display pre-recorded video or animated sequences with visuals that home consoles couldn't match. But for the most part, if you were playing a video or computer game in the 80s, you were almost certainly experiencing sprite-based, fairly cartoon-like, certainly not real, graphics. In the very late 80s into the early 90s, video game companies started to pioneer the concept of digitizing actors and putting them into games, a technology that would effectively act as a precursor to the whole full-motion video movement, which, like I mentioned, I am a huge fan of. For somebody like me who grew up with 8-bit color and cartoony graphics, the moment I saw actual actors appear on my television and computer monitor, it felt like video games had finally come of age, and that video game companies had finally figured out how to capture reality, which is why, for me, FMV games are truly something special. Even though FMV titles can be cheesy, and even though the acting is usually subpar, and even though many don't necessarily have top-flight Hollywood actors or anything like that, the simple fact is, I don't care. I love FMV games, warts and all, and even with the retrospective knowledge that FMV in gaming wasn't the be-all, end-all I expected it to be, I still remain hopelessly in love. I mention all of this to give some context, because Sierra, as they did with most advanced industry-leading trends and technology, went really in on full-motion video. The company believed interactive movies were going to be the next big thing in the video and computer game industry, and they knew that in order to remain one of the leading game development studios in the world, they'd have to figure out how to make their own FMV-based titles. But Sierra didn't want to simply film some acted sequences, add a couple cutscenes to a game, and then call it a day. That would have been a very low-effort attempt at integrating FMV technology into their games. No, Sierra wanted to do something special to announce to the world that they, too, were going to enter the FMV game market, and they wanted to make sure their most recognizable and bankable talent would be front and center for whatever their first FMV title was going to be. Longtime adventure game designer Roberta Williams, despite her work on the King's Quest series and Mixed Up Mother Goose, had always wanted to make an adult-oriented horror game. And in fact, if we look at her very first game, Mystery House, we can clearly see that Williams, from her very earliest efforts, wanted to deliver an experience that was a bit more grounded in mystery and suspense as opposed to fairy tales and fantasy. While Williams didn't regret her decision to focus on the fantasy-themed King's Quest series, she always maintained a desire to return to more mature fare. Only here, the technology of the time just wasn't advanced enough to allow Williams to create an adult-oriented horror title that she believed would resonate with the game-playing public. Roberta had always maintained the belief that in order for an individual to experience true horror, they'd need to believe that they were witnessing something real. And despite the best efforts of artists and graphic designers, the computer technology of the 80s and early 90s was not capable of delivering realistic visuals, other than potentially digitized actors as sprites, which had been used in a few late 80s adventure games, most prominently featured in the work of Tex Murphy and Lynx creator Access Software. Even so, digitized actors wouldn't be able to convey the kind of emotion Williams believed was necessary for a truly impactful horror title. To really hit the mark, Williams believed that the experience would have to be more similar to a film, with real recorded video sequences and quality actors, as opposed to a game with digitized sprites. Which meant, for Williams to make the horror game she wanted to make, the only solution was to use full motion video technology. Luckily for Williams, as the early 90s progressed, CD-ROMs made it so that game designers could in fact deliver pre-recorded video as part of their games, and a number of new FMV titles had begun to release on the market. Some good, some not so good. Now, the curious amongst you might be wondering why early FMV titles varied so widely in terms of overall quality, because while I remain a lifelong FMV and gaming fan, even I recognize that not all FMV games are actually worthwhile experiences. So, why were some FMV titles so poorly received? Well, one issue was the fact that game designers of the time didn't really know how best to combine the interactive nature of games with the decidedly passive act of watching video sequences, with many game designers deciding to double down on the concept of making quote-unquote interactive movies, with interactivity relegated to simply selecting from a set of different options at various points in a game's playthrough, effectively making a video-based choose-your-own-adventure experience. These titles could be fun, but for a vast majority of gamers, reducing an entire game down to a series of pre-recorded cutscenes combined with some light QuickTime events was not the experience they really wanted out of their video games. Another somewhat related issue is the fact that creating an FMV game was, in some instances, easier than creating a standard sprite-based pixel art title, simply because you didn't have to worry about creating a ton of hand-drawn art or building things from scratch. For the lowest effort FMV titles, designers would simply film themselves or their friends in various real-world locations, often without any degree of sets or real filmmaking expertise, followed by stitching those filmed sequences together into a quote-unquote game. These low-budget, low-effort attempts would end up giving FMV games a pretty bad rap, especially as more and more FMV titles flooded the market. Even the really well-designed games were often assumed to be less fun than a game with more traditional graphics and gameplay, and that negative perception, unfortunately, was a hard hurdle to overcome. Unless, of course, you were Sierra Online, who had both the money, resources, and name recognition at their disposal to make an FMV game with a level of quality that other companies had no way of matching. Which is why, when Sierra decided to make their first FMV game, they decided to go all in on the process, dedicating the right staff and the right creative talent to their forthcoming project, with Roberta Williams announced as the creator for the game that would eventually come to be known as Phantasmagoria. When Williams began conceptualizing the more concrete details behind Phantasmagoria, she took inspiration from a ton of different horror films, television shows, and books, spending close to 6 months doing nothing except watching horror movies and reading novels by the likes of Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe, all in the hopes of learning what made horror, horror. Williams was determined to create a game that would strike dread in its players, and interestingly enough, while she was immersing herself in the world of horror, Williams began having some pretty horrible nightmares, which actually forced her to pull back a bit on her self-imposed horror binge. While Williams was a bit concerned about the nightmares she was having and the feelings she was experiencing, she considered the whole thing as a net win. If she was able to make herself that scared, then she knew she was on the right track to uncover the essential elements of fear that she could, hopefully, use in Phantasmagoria. Williams, however, couldn't simply focus on the creation of the game's story, because, as Sierra's first FMV title, she also wanted to be involved in the overall production of the game itself, including making sure that the company had the right kind of approach to film production that would enable Williams to bring her vision to life. As part of the production for Phantasmagoria, Sierra would undertake the creation of a brand new $1.5 million film studio, designed specifically to film the various sequences that would be required to make Phantasmagoria a reality. The entire studio was designed as a series of different chroma key sets, where actors would need to perform various scenes in front of a blue screen, after which the solid blue color background would be removed and replaced with computer-generated images to create the illusion that real actors were inhabiting the virtual in-game world. Creating an entire film recording studio for a future unproven game would prove to be a pretty risky move for Sierra. And in a somewhat interesting turn of events, Ken Williams, the company's CEO, was not entirely happy with the fact that the company was spending $1.5 million on a brand new building, when he knew he'd have to spend even more money on actually creating the game itself. While Ken was always a believer in using the latest technology to deliver previously unexpected experiences to gamers, he was also a believer in not spending money unless necessary, and he had some real trepidation with approving the $1.5 million studio project, not to mention the initial $800,000 that Roberta Williams believed it would take to create the game using Sierra's brand new studio. Ken pushed back on all of these expenses, and I'm very curious what would have happened if Phantasmagoria's designer would have been anyone other than his wife, because while I have no proof of this, I've got to believe that the reason Ken relented in spending so much money was because Roberta was attached to the project. Whether my assumption is true or not, the fact is that Ken did approve the $1.5 million studio build, and he did approve an $800,000 budget for the game to be created. As work on the studio completed, Roberta was able to turn her attention to the filming process for the game, as the story for Phantasmagoria was, at this point, fairly complete. And actually, it was more than just complete. It was super complete. Excessively complete. Over the top complete. You see, Phantasmagoria was a big story. So big, in fact, that Williams' initial script equaled over 500 pages in length, the equivalent of 4 full-length Hollywood films. And because the game was intended to be a full-motion video title, that meant that turning that script into a game would require an extensive amount of filming, editing, and compositing, as well as a ton of casting, directing, and post-production, all skills that Sierra didn't have in-house. The company understood how to make traditional games, but turning what was effectively a Hollywood-like film production into a playable, high-quality gaming experience? Nobody really knew how to make that a reality. So Sierra did the only thing a company of its size could do. It went out and hired the staff it would need to fill in the gaps in its own workforce, bringing on directors, camera people, set designers, production crew, special effects wizards, and anything else that the team believed it would need in order to make Phantasmagoria the best possible FMV title it could be. Seriously, the level of staffing that Sierra employed for Phantasmagoria bordered on crazy, as at one point, the team working on the game would balloon to over 200 people, many of those being responsible for the film part of the experience rather than the game part of the experience. And speaking of the film part of the experience, in addition to all of the production crew that Sierra would end up hiring, the other key piece of the filming experience was, of course, hiring actual real actors to portray the various characters in the game's story. In a move that proved just how committed Sierra was to the whole project, the team wouldn't just hire a bunch of amateur actors or use Sierra employees to take on the roles needed for the game. Instead, Sierra would work with actual Hollywood acting agencies to identify different actors who might be interested in joining the game's production, with a number of different actors, primarily those with stage and television experience, being selected to embody the characters that Roberta Williams had created for her story. As various actors were cast and filming began, Williams would work with the various newly hired staff, including Hollywood film director Peter Maris, to learn as much as she could about the act of filming a performance, while much of the film crew would learn directly from Williams about how different interactive portions of the experience would mesh with the filmed sequences, a form of cross-pollination of knowledge across Phantasmagoria's creative team that would, hopefully, improve both the film and interactive portions of the title. Actually getting the filmed sequences composited into the game's world would utilize chroma key technology, combined with computer-generated environments and graphics, though here, there were actually a few more hurdles to overcome than what you might expect. The issue was, the majority of actors that had been cast for the game had never worked on a blue-screen chroma key set before, in which most of the objects and environments you're supposed to be using and interacting with don't actually exist in the real world. This required some trial and error on the parts of various actors in order to learn how best to perform their various scenes, with some actors, like David Holm, who portrays Don Gordon in the game, occasionally walking through the virtual world's walls, simply because he didn't realize where they were. Lead actress Victoria Morcell, who plays Don's wife Adrienne Delaney, also had difficulty working in a blue screen environment, and believed the whole process to be way more restrictive than she ever expected, primarily because she could rely only on her imagination to get her through various scenes, and nobody would actually know if she hit the mark until later on when her performance would be added to the computer-generated environments created for the game. In fact, the entire film shoot was incredibly challenging for all involved, as it took 4 months of filming 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, to finally capture all of the performances needed for the 600 scenes included in Phantasmagoria. And that's not even to mention all of the time spent filming Morcell performing all sorts of everyday actions, like opening drawers and simply walking across an open space, a level of detail that was essential in order to reflect all possible player actions as filmed sequences in the game itself. Interestingly, the number of filmed sequences required for these mundane actions was almost an impediment to the game's production, because early on in the process, there were intentions to allow lead character Adrienne to wear different clothes as the game progressed, a concept that seems simple enough. The issue was, because the game was intended to take place in an environment that players could explore at various points throughout the story, using different clothes as the game progressed would have meant that Victoria Morcell would have had to have been filmed performing the same exact actions wearing different clothes each time, a process that would have literally added months to the production. Realizing that this approach wasn't going to be feasible, the decision was made to keep Adrienne in her standard black pants, orange sweater ensemble throughout the entire game. So, if you ever wondered why there were no costume changes throughout Phantasmagoria's various chapters, well, that's the reason. Kinda interesting when you think about it. Before we move on from discussing the filming of the game's various FMV scenes, I do need to relay a piece of trivia that I found fascinating, if not a bit revolting. No spoilers, but at one point late in the game, the main character will find herself in a situation where she's in imminent danger, and if she doesn't do something fast, a swinging axe is going to literally collide with her head. Making this look as real as possible would fall to the film production's special effects team, and in a surprise move, it was determined that the special effects for that potentially gruesome death could not be filmed using computer-generated imagery, but instead needed to be a practical effect, meaning a special effect created with mechanical and physical objects in the real world. So, the special effects team constructed a model of Victoria Morcell's head, piped in fake blood, and made it look as realistic as possible, before allowing a real swinging axe to collide with that model, spilling bloody bits of fake head everywhere. So far, so good. The issue, however, was that the film crew needed to film that sequence multiple times, and the special effects team only had a single model of Morcell's head, which after any give and take would be absolutely decimated. This meant that every time that head model was destroyed, the special effects team needed to reassemble the whole thing, bit by gory bit, until the next take was ready to film. I cannot imagine being the guy responsible for finding all of the little chunks of obliterated cranium and needing to reconstruct those pieces into a reasonable facsimile of an actual human head. I've got to believe that was a bit of a thankless job. Anyway, eventually all of the filming for the project would be complete, which meant it was now time to add those sequences into an actual playable game. And here, Roberta Williams had some specific ideas about how to make Phantasmagoria a bit less complex to play than many of its adventure game ancestors. The issue was, the standard adventure game of the time often provided players with a number of different actions that they could use when interacting with the game and its world. Things like look, examine, talk, pick up, use, push, and other similar simple action verbs. Figuring out what verb command to use in a given situation was pretty much a staple of the adventure game genre for as long as it existed, including as far back as the earliest text-driven adventure titles. And for gamers accustomed to playing adventure games, this kind of a setup was nothing unexpected. The thing is, though, Phantasmagoria was not being envisioned as a hardcore adventure game experience. It was being envisioned as an interactive movie, something that could be enjoyed by veteran adventure gamers, but could also be enjoyed by casual players, or even horror film aficionados, who might have never point and clicked their way through any prior adventure titles before. In order to make the experience more accessible for these more casual consumers, Williams made the decision to streamline the game's interface and puzzle design dramatically, making it so that players would never have to select what verb or action to perform. The game would simply do the thing it was supposed to do, as long as you clicked on a hotspot or object that had an action associated with it. And any interactable spot in the game would cause your mouse cursor to turn red to let players know that this was something that you can actually perform in the game world. In this way, Phantasmagoria would be made much simpler than its adventure game peers, and while some of the adventure game community would feel that Phantasmagoria was too dumbed down to be a legitimate adventure experience, Williams felt that this was a necessary compromise in order to reach the most broad population of potential players, and in the process, hopefully help the game sell even more copies. Further refinements to the game's design would continue to be made, once again to make the game as accessible and familiar to newcomers as possible, including splitting the game up into a series of chapters, similar to what you might encounter when reading a popular horror novel, with each chapter being a fairly brisk and narrative-driven experience, especially in comparison to more puzzle-centric adventure titles. The hope here, as with the interface and puzzle changes we just discussed, was that the game would be accessible to people who might have an interest in horror experiences, but might not have had much experience actually playing a computer game. Williams and the Sierra team really wanted Phantasmagoria to be a mainstream hit, and they were doing everything in their power to make the game appeal to the general population, while also, hopefully, delivering an experience that seasoned adventure gamers would enjoy. The only question was, would Williams and the team be able to deliver the kind of experience that would resonate with enough people to make Phantasmagoria a blockbuster hit for Sierra Online? Well, the answer to that question would take significantly longer to answer than anyone ever anticipated, as Phantasmagoria's initial project timeline and budget would be blown out of the water as everyone on the team, Williams included, came to grips with the fact that they had vastly underestimated the effort needed to bring a high-quality, big-budget FMV title to life. And here, the other Williams, Roberta's husband Ken, was not particularly happy. Recall that we talked about the fact that Ken Williams liked making money, and he didn't particularly want to spend a ton of money on an unproven, risky project. Roberta had convinced Ken to not only build a $1.5 million film studio, but also persuaded him to invest $800,000 in the creation of the game, after that film studio had been completed. As production on Phantasmagoria progressed, it would become apparent that $800,000 was just not enough money to bring Roberta's vision to life. So you might be wondering, how much would Phantasmagoria eventually cost? If you guessed $4.5 million, you'd be right, which was an absolutely astronomical figure for a computer game in the mid-90s, not to mention the fact that the game would be delayed multiple times and increase in scope several times over, before finally releasing to the public. What was at one point expected to be a simple 2-disc CD-ROM title would balloon to a 7-disc behemoth, becoming one of the biggest games ever made, at least up to that point in history, and introducing a number of other complexities that the team hadn't even considered, like how to minimize disc swapping while in a single chapter. Nothing would break immersion more than having to swap discs whenever you navigate from one room to the next, so the team ended up including a number of duplicative scenes and video sequences across multiple discs, simply to make it so that players wouldn't have to swap discs quite as frequently. Yet another way, Sierra was attempting to reduce the barrier to entry and technical know-how of Phantasmagoria's eventual player base. With the project nearly 6 times over budget and delayed by over a year, Phantasmagoria would have to be a really big hit for Sierra to recoup its investment, and when Phantasmagoria finally released on the market in August of 1995, the entire Sierra team, Ken Williams included, awaited initial sales numbers with a level of anxiety that was certainly not typical of a standard Sierra release. The company had been very successful with past titles, but Phantasmagoria was the most expensive game they had ever made, and it wasn't even close. The only question was, would Sierra's gamble pay off? It turns out the answer to that question is yes. Yes, it would, as Phantasmagoria would sell 300,000 copies in its first weekend of release, en route to selling over 1 million copies overall in its first year of release, representing the first time a Sierra adventure would ever cross the 1 million threshold. Commercially, Phantasmagoria would be a mega success for Sierra, and its performance alone would make Sierra's stock price increase to 10 times its initial value from 1995 to 1996. That is an absolutely ludicrous stock jump, and as you might expect, Ken Williams was pretty darn happy with the games and the company's performance. Sure, he may have had doubts during the game's prolonged production, but now that the results were in, Ken was over the moon. So much so that he asked Roberta to begin working on a sequel nearly immediately upon recognizing that Phantasmagoria was a hit. Unfortunately for Ken, Roberta had other plans, as she was about to return to the series that made her a superstar in the adventure game industry, that being, of course, King's Quest. There would eventually be a Phantasmagoria 2, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but that would ultimately not include Williams' involvement, and would therefore be a much different experience than Roberta's haunted house-themed horror title. Anyway, while Phantasmagoria would be a success commercially, it wouldn't be quite as well received from a critical perspective. Sure, there were some critics that loved the horror elements, the gory and grotesque filmed sequences, and the general gameplay evolution that made the game one of the more expansive and expensive interactive films to have ever been made. But other critics would be a bit more harsh, with some of the elements that other critics praised being a complaint by others, proving definitively that you just can't make everyone happy, and also demonstrating that if you're going to work in any sort of creative field, you need to stick to your vision and be true to yourself, regardless of what the critical community may say. And for her part, Roberta Williams truly did stick with her creative vision for the title, and in the process, the game would stir up quite a bit of controversy shortly after its release. As we talked about, Phantasmagoria was intended to be a mature game for adult audiences, with a number of gory and grotesque deaths and, in at least one instance, a filmed sequence depicting the sexual assault of the main character in the game. Williams and Sierra came under intense scrutiny for the decision to include a sexual assault as part of the video game, and even though the development team built in ways to censor the game's content should a player desire, which, by the way, was a voluntary addition to the game's options, that did not stop a number of retailers, critics, and media watchdog groups from attacking the game and its mature subject matter. Roberta Williams would participate in countless interviews to explain her rationale for the game's content, and over time, some of the initial controversy surrounding the game would begin to dissipate, primarily because of Williams' own savvy with the press, which helped to diffuse the situation before it reached a fever pitch. Regardless, Phantasmagoria would remain fairly controversial over the course of its lifetime, with several countries banning the title outright, an outcome that, while not ideal, wouldn't dramatically impact the game's adoption across the broader gaming community. Phantasmagoria would be followed up by a sequel entitled Phantasmagoria: A Puzzle of Flesh, though it would be an entirely standalone story and experience not associated with the original title at all. A Puzzle of Flesh would end up pushing the level of mature content even further than its predecessor, and would feature even more advanced FMV technology with a more unsettling story, though despite the development team's best efforts, the sequel would end up not being as well received as the first Phantasmagoria title, both in terms of its critical and commercial performance. With that lack of performance, prospects for a third Phantasmagoria title effectively flew out the window, though at the time, Roberta Williams did note that she could potentially return to create a third installment in the series if fan feedback was significant enough. Unfortunately, that comment was made back in the late 90s, and given the fact that Sierra as a company no longer exists, and Roberta Williams is mostly retired from the game industry, it certainly seems like we'll never see a Phantasmagoria 3. Which, from my perspective, is a shame, because even though Phantasmagoria might not have been the most well-received critical title, and it might have been a much simplified adventure game experience, that in no way diminishes the efforts of Roberta Williams and the broader Sierra team in bringing the game to life. With Phantasmagoria, Sierra would experience their biggest, most commercially successful release ever, proving to everyone across the industry that Roberta Williams could deliver a hit adventure title regardless of its subject matter, further cementing Williams' legendary status in the adventure game industry. Phantasmagoria may not have spawned a huge franchise, and it may not be quite as well respected today, but from my perspective, the game still maintains an important spot in video and computer game history, and as such is definitely a title that deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Phantasmagoria today versus when it was released 30 years ago. Phantasmagoria at its core is a point-and-click adventure game, similar in many ways to any number of other adventure titles that we've looked at over the last 3 years, in that you control a character from a third-person perspective and, over the course of the game, will navigate and explore a variety of environments, talk with a number of different characters, acquire and use a collection of different items, and use those items to solve a smattering of puzzles that are integrated into the overall storyline of the game. Hearing that description, you might think that Phantasmagoria is simply another point-and-click adventure title. And yes, I will admit that the game in many ways feels like a fairly traditional adventure experience. But there are actually a number of things that Phantasmagoria does differently than many other adventure games, some of which serve to streamline and evolve the adventure formula, while other unique features of the game serve to simplify the game a bit more than what I think most adventure gamers are going to appreciate. The question, at the end of the day, is if Phantasmagoria's combination of traditional adventure mechanics and unique gameplay changes make it a worthwhile experience for you to play today. Well, I've got the answer to that question, so let's start talking about Phantasmagoria. The first thing you need to realize when starting to play Phantasmagoria is that it is a full motion video title, which longtime listeners of the podcast know is something that automatically puts a game in my good graces. I have not been shy about the fact that I love FMV titles, from the most well-produced Hollywood-level productions to the schlockiest B-movie-style narratives with worse-than-amateur actors. I pretty much love every FMV game, though that blind adoration does not prevent me from providing critique about the objective experience of playing any of these games. For Phantasmagoria in particular, Sierra decided to design Phantasmagoria as a mix of FMV acted sequences overlaid with computer-generated imagery, effectively requiring every acting performance to be chroma keyed and integrated into environments and locations that existed solely within the digital confines of a server farm, as opposed to any real-world, on-location kinds of film sequences. This is not a particularly unique style of FMV experience, as many FMV games from the 90s integrated real actors with computer-generated environments as the basis of their visuals. And my suspicion is that filming a bunch of actors in front of a green screen and then having an art team create the game world is most likely a more cost-effective production than attempting to fly a cast and crew to various locations, submit the permits to allow filming at those locations, and then figure out how to add some degree of interactivity to those fully pre-recorded scenes. Phantasmagoria, like other FMV titles of the time such as Under a Killing Moon, Ripper, and Harvester, use digitized actors and pre-rendered backgrounds as the foundation of the gameplay experience, coupled of course with fully filmed sequences that will play out at various points throughout your playthrough. And actually, let me take a step back. I just kinda lied. I said that fully filmed sequences play out at various points during your playthrough, and that was a bit of a misrepresentation. In fact, Phantasmagoria is almost exclusively a series of stitched-together FMV sequences, in that almost every action you take will result in some sort of pre-recorded sequence being played. I'll give you an example, right from the start of the game. You begin Phantasmagoria in the kitchen of your new home, and your character, Adrian Delaney, standing in front of a kitchen table. As you gain control of the game, you'll notice that you can move your mouse cursor around the screen just like every other mouse-driven adventure game ever created. Eventually, you may mouse over an area that turns that cursor red, which means you've just found some sort of interactive hotspot, whether an item to examine or pick up, or an environmental interaction to experience. In this case, you likely found a drawer in a nearby table, in which case clicking your now red cursor will, as you might expect, open that drawer. Now, some adventure games might simply have the drawer open for you once you click the hotspot, without having to play out a series of animations or cutscenes in order to execute your action. Well, in Phantasmagoria, every action you take will result in a filmed sequence playing, which means when you click that drawer, you're going to see your character, Adrian, walk to the drawer and open it up. After you examine the drawer and decide to close it, you will once again watch a filmed sequence of Adrian closing that drawer before you're given control of the game again. Then, let's say you want to open a door to a nearby pantry. Well, clicking on the door will make your character walk across the room and, once again, play a filmed sequence of Adrian opening the door. Same thing if you decide to close the door, or do something in that room, or, quite frankly, do anything else in the game. Now look, The concept of watching your character take an action you've instructed him or her to do is a staple of many third-person point-and-click adventures, so some of you might be wondering why I'm choosing to focus on this aspect of the game, when in reality, it's not all that different than any number of other adventure games. The issue is that all of those actions require an FMV sequence to be played before those actions occur, and even for someone who loves FMV in games, having to watch those same exact sequences every time I try to do something gets really, really old after a while. Interestingly, I think the game's design team realized that the repetitiveness of these sequences could potentially get tiresome for players to watch over and over and over again, so the game does actually include a button on the interface that allows you to skip the currently playing video sequence, which speeds gameplay up quite a bit. And in fact, for many of these filler kinds of filmed sequences, the game even moves your cursor over to the skip button automatically every time one of those sequences begins to play. I'll admit, I appreciated the forethought by the design team to allow everyone the option to skip these highly repetitive sequences, and I doubly appreciated the fact that the game helpfully moves your cursor right over the skip button so that if you want to, all you need to do is click to skip as opposed to having to move your mouse over the button and then click. It's a super minor thing, but I legitimately thought it was a nice touch. Though I do have to wonder about the value of those sequences in general, and the fact that the design team gave you a mechanism to skip the sequences outright suggests to me that at least someone at Sierra agreed with me and recognized that playing those same pre-recorded sequences over and over again was going to get old pretty quickly, which admittedly it did. Alternatively, I suppose adding the ability to skip those scenes might have simply been a way to streamline the gameplay experience, and here there's actually quite a bit of support behind that assertion. Because Phantasmagoria on a whole feels to me to be an incredibly streamlined, and perhaps too streamlined adventure experience. Take, for example, your mouse cursor. In many adventure games, you have several different options available to you for interacting with the environment, like the fairly pervasive look, use, pick up, and open commands. Some games, like the Broken Sword series, streamline that interface designed to effectively have two different actions. One, tied to your left click, allowed you to perform some default action depending on what you might be mousing over. If your cursor was over a door, then the default action would be open or close. If your cursor was over another character, then the default action would be to speak with that character. If your cursor was over an inventory object, the default action would be to pick it up. You get the picture. Broken Sword and many other streamlined adventure titles added the ability to examine environmental hotspots and items by right-clicking those hotspots and items, giving you the opportunity to learn more about the world around you while still maintaining much more streamlined gameplay than what was prevalent in older school adventure games. Well, Phantasmagoria goes one step further, in that anything that can be interacted with only requires a single left click to do whatever it is you're supposed to do with that interactive hotspot, which sounds similar to the way games like Broken Sword handled the situation, but in reality is a bit less elegant than other implementations of a similar system. In Broken Sword, even though left-clicking automatically selects a default action, the cursor over that hotspot or item changes to reflect the default action that's going to be taken, which was a great way of communicating to the player what action you were about to take. In Phantasmagoria, the only thing that happens is your normal cursor turns red, which is just kinda there. I mean, I get it, since Phantasmagoria is effectively an interactive movie, you'd expect the degree of interaction to be a bit less than other non-FMV adventure titles. But even so, I'm not sure I'm a fan of the scan the environment and find a colored hotspot kind of gameplay that this style of user interface promotes. It's not the worst thing in the world, and it is, at the end of the day, a minor annoyance, but it is something that, at least during my latest playthrough, I felt might have been a bit too simplistic for a seasoned adventure gamer. Even more simplistic though, and something that I have a bit more of an issue with, is the degree to which the game's puzzle design was made almost too logical for its own good. Phantasmagoria was designed by Roberta Williams, the legendary designer who gave us the King's Quest series, and in the process introduced some really, really convoluted puzzles into the adventure game universe. I've mentioned before that I'm not entirely convinced Ms. Williams is the best puzzle designer, but at a minimum, all of her puzzles have had at least some internal logic to them that oftentimes is a bit more obscure than simple real-world logic. Well, Phantasmagoria is an example of a Roberta Williams adventure that is excessively logical, meaning that there is pretty much no puzzle here that will tax anyone's brain at all, short of a couple of items that have somewhat hidden interactivity that you might miss unless you were examining your inventory pretty closely. Otherwise, the overall puzzle design is designed so simplistically that I almost have a hard time classifying these interactive experiences as quote-unquote puzzles. You know how some of the best adventure games have chains of puzzles whose items and logic are dependent on one another, where you might need to combine inventory items to form new and useful objects and all that good stuff? None of that exists in Phantasmagoria. See a nail in a wall? Well, use a hammer to pry it out. See a wooden wall that might be hiding a secret room? Use a hammer to smash the wall to bits. See a deranged and demonically possessed man who's trying to kill you? Whack him in the head with a hammer and go on about your day. I know, it might sound odd for me to complain about the logical nature of these sequences, because in the past, I have also complained about adventure games whose puzzles are entirely illogical. And to that, I say, yep, I know. The fact is, though, that the best adventure games strike a balance between real-world logic, in-game logic, and logical but educated leaps and inferences to arrive at puzzle solutions. Games that are too convoluted can be frustrating, and games that are too simple can tend to be not engaging enough. Phantasmagoria falls squarely in the latter category, and as a result, the quality of its adventuring experience, and specifically the quality of its so-called puzzles, suffers. This degree of streamlining and oversimplification also extends to the game's dialogue system, which is quite frankly non-existent. There are no dialogue trees here. There are no options available to you to converse intelligently with other characters. There's no asking characters about random items in your inventory. None of that exists here. Instead, if you see someone you want to speak with, all you do is click them and then a dialogue scene plays out. If there's more to learn from a given character, simply click them again and a different dialogue scene plays out, and so on. This structure of click, watch a scene, and click again continues until you've exhausted all dialogue with a given character, at which point the game settles into a scene that will simply repeat ad nauseum whenever you click on that character in the future. This again is an area that I feel was way too simplified for its own good, and in some cases even introduced some weird story inconsistencies where certain dialogue scenes played out based on information and questions that your character in the game hadn't yet discovered, which, while not a major continuity issue, did surprise me a bit. Now, some of you might be thinking that an FMV-styled adventure would necessitate this degree of simplification and streamlining, simply due to the format of the game. But here, I'd argue that the better FMV adventures do in fact maintain a fair degree of interactivity, gameplay depth, and traditional adventure game mechanics like dialogue trees, despite their FMV underpinnings. It's entirely possible to have a deep and engaging FMV-styled adventure game. The only issue is, Phantasmagoria isn't it. It's about as lightweight of an adventure experience as there is, and in many ways, is less engaging as a result. I began to think about why the game was designed like this, and the only answer I can come up with is that Sierra and Roberta Williams really wanted Phantasmagoria to be a mainstream hit, and didn't want to simply cater to the already established adventure game market, which, while still strong at the point in time Phantasmagoria came out, was not in any way big enough to be considered mainstream. Phantasmagoria was Sierra's attempt at capturing an audience who may not be familiar with adventure games, and in order to do that, they had to deliver an experience that would be playable and solvable by those less seasoned players. That design decision might have helped game sales, but it does not endear Phantasmagoria to veteran adventure gamers as a deep and engaging experience. I'm going to guess some of you might be shocked by how harsh I'm being on the game, because I have gone on record previously as suggesting that Phantasmagoria is one of my guilty pleasure experiences, the equivalent of watching a movie or television show that you know isn't top-flight entertainment, but is enjoyable nonetheless. And interestingly, despite my critique thus far, I still think Phantasmagoria is a super fun guilty pleasure experience, despite the flaws I've just been talking about. The thing is, as an adventure game, Phantasmagoria is too simplistic to appeal to adventure game aficionados, or at least is too simplistic to provide an experience that will drive any sort of challenge for adventure gamers who have experience with other Sierra and LucasArts titles. But let's say for a second that you stop thinking about Phantasmagoria as a quote-unquote adventure game, and therefore put aside all of the expectations that come with that particular genre of game. What if, instead, you simply think of Phantasmagoria as an interactive horror film, something that could just as easily have been released on Netflix as a choose-your-own-adventure kind of experience as opposed to a true point-and-click adventure? Well, if you think about the game like that, then you start to look at Phantasmagoria in an entirely different light. Because, as an interactive movie, Phantasmagoria is perhaps one of the more well-produced interactive film experiences that has ever been created. Sure, the game is mostly linear, and there is little if any player choice included here. But if you're looking for an experience that lets you star in your very own horror film and, to a degree, control the actions of the main character of that film, then Phantasmagoria might just be exactly what you're looking for. I recognize that it might sound like a silly distinction to say that Phantasmagoria is a great interactive film but a subpar adventure game, but in this instance, that characterization is entirely valid. I firmly believe that the reason Phantasmagoria has been criticized by a portion of the adventure game community is because they went into it expecting, an adventure game, and who can fault them given the game's pedigree and marketing? But if you instead go into the game assuming you're going to play and experience an interesting interactive film as opposed to a deep and engaging adventure, then the game takes on a much more positive light and becomes, as I've always asserted it to be, a guilty pleasure kind of experience. We're going to dive deeper and talk about the more specific aspects of the game, regardless of what type of game you personally believe it to be, in just a couple minutes. First, though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, most of the time our buying decisions were made off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like in the store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Phantasmagoria for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms, the back of the box says, I feel its presence, its fingers upon my throat. I hear its eerie sounds, unsettling my every thought. I try in vain to slumber, my reveries gripped by violent terror. My only salvation, the shock of awakening. Something is very, very wrong here. There are some screenshots then after that little blurb with captions. One says, enter a frighteningly believable, ominous adventure. What begins as a dream soon becomes a nightmare. Horror unfolds in taut, gripping chapters filling 7 CDs. Built-in hint option moves you quickly through dazzling 3D rendered scenes, and lush realism and a haunting soundtrack creates a nightmare you won't forget. And then another little blurb on the back of the box says, Master storyteller Roberta Williams challenges you to experience the ultimate interactive nightmare. And then there is a warning on the back of the box messaging or mentioning that the game does contain adult subject matter and parental guidance is suggested, not for children under 13. There's also a mature 17 plus label on the back of the box. And I have got to say, yeah, this one sells me on the game. I know there's not a whole heck of a lot back here, but the fact that they have FMV sequences and the screenshots on the back of the box, the graphics look really great. It's a horror game. It's a horror FMV interactive adventure game. At least that's how it's being sold by Roberta Williams. Yep. This box totally sells me on the title. It's a main reason why I bought the game back when it first came out, and it's a main reason why the game is still sitting on my shelf even today. I do think this is a good back of the box for this style of game. That being said, does the back of the box really translate into the act of playing the game? We're going to find that out right now as we start diving into the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. There are a few different aspects to the graphics in Phantasmagoria, and each requires their own discussion. To start, let's take a look at the game's filmed sequences, and specifically, the quality of the recorded video. The FMV quality when looking at the recorded actors is mostly high quality, with a bit of compression and lower quality colors than what you might see from, say, a digital video cartridge-equipped Philips CDI, but still better than the quality of many other DOS-based FMV titles. You can tell fairly immediately that all of these filmed sequences were directed in a style reminiscent of a Hollywood production, and from my perspective, the overall production quality and cinematography of those filmed sequences were very well done. A bit less well done, or at least a bit more aged than the pure recorded sequences, were the computer-generated graphics that formed the background of many of those pre-recorded scenes. Like I mentioned earlier, Phantasmagoria uses actors performing in front of a green screen chroma key kind of setup, who are then superimposed over a computer-generated world, creating a hybrid visual experience where real-world actors are interacting with a totally virtual environment. That virtual environment admittedly looks like it was created in the 90s, meaning it has that telltale, attempting to be realistic but ultimately not looking at all realistic look to it, similar to countless other titles from the 90s that used advanced, for the time, pre-rendered imagery to hopefully wow gamers. I remember the graphics and pre-rendered environments in Phantasmagoria looking amazing when I played the game in 1995. In 2025, they definitely look their age. That being said, I think the Sierra team did a fantastic job of integrating actors with the virtual environments that permeated the game world, and while the graphics themselves might look dated, the degree to which the real-world actors appear to actually inhabit the game world is nothing short of astonishing. Most games that utilize a similar style of digitized actors or chroma keyed actors moving through a digitized environment very much look like they're moving through a digital environment. That really isn't the case here, and anytime a character interacts with the digital game world, you get the sense that they really are interacting with that world. Even something that objectively looks so fake, like when Adrian runs her hands under fake water and shakes off the excess, feels like it was more real than it had any right being. I don't know if that's because of the actor's own abilities working in a green screen environment, or if the Sierra art and design team simply took great effort to overlay graphics on top of nondescript real-world sets, but the end result is the same. The actors in all of the pre-rendered computer-generated environments look more natural than they have any right being, and I was pleasantly surprised at just how good those interactions looked. Also surprising to me was how gory the game was, which, holy cow, I'm not even sure I have the words to describe the level of gore that certain scenes in the game contain. For awareness, I have played Phantasmagoria before, so I had a pretty good recollection of the various scenes in the game when I sat down to play it again for this episode, but for some reason, I had forgotten just how detailed and violent some of the scenes were. I will admit, if I were someone with a weaker stomach, I might even classify some of the scenes as overtly grotesque, with a couple of late-game deaths being perhaps some of the most horrific FMV-filmed death sequences that I've ever seen in a game. The overall quality of the gore here looks really good, and I have to commend the special effects team for the practical effects used in those sequences. From what I can tell, none of the gory deaths in the game were computer-generated, which I think took a lot of guts, literally, to put on film for an interactive game. I know one of the goals with Phantasmagoria was to make a more mature experience than most of Sierra's titles, and I can say with certainty that from a gore perspective, the team definitely succeeded. The only other item we need to talk about as it relates to the game's visuals are a series of pre-rendered animated FMV sequences, all of which are, to put it mildly, a function of the time they were created in. All of these sequences are very dated, though maintain a degree of charm, simply because you can tell the art team put their all into the creation of those sequences. It's just that the available technology wasn't powerful enough to really deliver the kinds of visuals that would continue to look quote-unquote good even today. I personally feel a fair amount of nostalgia looking at graphics like those included in the pre-rendered animated cutscenes, but if someone hadn't grown up during this era of pseudo-realistic but not actually realistic graphics, they might feel just a little bit differently. Overall, the visuals in Phantasmagoria are mostly well done, with some aged graphics being partly offset by the general quality of the 90s era graphical design and integration between the filmed sequences and in-game environments. To sum it up, the game doesn't look bad at all, though it does certainly look older in comparison to more modern titles. Moving on to the sound and music, similar to the graphics, the audio in Phantasmagoria needs to be discussed from several different perspectives, and to start, we're going to look at the music, which itself needs to be split into two separate discussions: the synthesized ambient audio and the digital pre-recorded real-world music, which in this context is mostly limited to Latin-speaking choirs sounding super gothic and scary. As it relates to the synthesized music in the game, it's okay, I guess. I mean, there's nothing particularly offensive about the MIDI-based music, and if you have a high-quality sound card, or are emulating a high-quality sound card via ScumVM, DOSBox, or some similar software, then the music sounds fine. It's just that the majority of the background music in the game is composed to very much fit into the background, but ironically, it still features prominently as you play the game, if that makes any sense at all. You know how when you play some games, the music totally fades into the background, enhancing the experience, but ultimately not really being noticeable as a distinct set of tunes? That style of background music is designed to blend into the action on the screen, and is intended to be something players will notice, but not take notice of, if you know what I mean. And you know the style of game where the background music in any given scene isn't really background music at all, but is instead a creatively composed tune that whittles its way into your brain never to be forgotten? Think about games like Gabriel Knight and Secret of Monkey Island. That music, despite being quote-unquote background tracking, is designed so that it remains memorable, and it's given a position of prominence in the game scenes, with an appropriate volume to let players know you probably want to listen to this. Well, now think about what would happen if you took music that should remain in the background, but treat it like it's a memorable track. And that's what you get in Phantasmagoria. It's not that the synthesized music was bad, far from it. It's just that I felt like the way the audio was mixed made the background music too prominent in each scene, which in turn made it surprisingly less effective than if it had been allowed to fade into the background. More effective than the synthesized music is the digital audio, and here I'm specifically talking about the choral music that accompanies various filmed sequences throughout the game, as well as the game's introductory song. That music is freaking awesome, and ever since I first heard the opening bars of that main theme, Consumite furore, you know that song? It's remained in my memory, never to be forgotten. It's a really interesting mix of gothic-sounding choirs and an intriguing instrumentation, and I love how variations of that theme play throughout the game, most prominently during the various flashback sequences that show some really grisly deaths. Every time you hear the low boom of the bells, followed by the bass choir jumping in and singing some Latin phrase that sounds spooky but could have just as easily been Past the Salt, which, by the way, is Transide Salis in Latin, which, yep, that kind of sounds spooky. Every time that happened, I ended up with a smile on my face, because the music in those sequences is so good. The sound effects and ambient environmental noises, similarly, are all pretty darn good as well, with a nice soundscape in each scene that really does draw you deeper into the game. While the controls and general puzzle structure of Phantasmagoria might not be the deepest thing in the world, the environmental audio from the perspective of an interactive film really works here, and I think the audio team did a great job in making the game's effects sound good. The only other aspect of the audio to mention is the recorded audio for each of the actors, which for the most part was just fine. You can hear some compression artifacts, and some of the audio is muffled just a little bit, most likely owing to a lower resolution for the recorded audio, which I can completely understand given the time that the game was created in. Overall, the recorded dialogue here sounds fine, though you can certainly tell it's an older title by virtue of the lower fidelity recordings. Overall, the audio in Phantasmagoria all sounds pretty good, and even the critiques I levied against the auditory environment were all relatively minor. For the most part, Phantasmagoria is one good-sounding game. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Phantasmagoria, you play as Adrienne Delaney, a woman who, along with her husband Don, has just purchased a new home, a mansion-like estate that was once owned by an illusionist of some prominence in the 1800s, Zoltan Karnavash. As most people do when they buy a new home, you set out to begin exploring your new surroundings to become acclimated to the house that you will now be living in. Also, like most people, at least those who find themselves starring in a haunted house horror film, the house that you've just purchased isn't exactly what it seems, and could potentially be hiding some dark secrets. As strange things begin happening, and as once-loved partners begin to deteriorate into a vicious cycle of anger and violence, you need to take it upon yourself to figure out what's going on and, hopefully, defeat the evil menace that appears to be taking over your life. With any luck, you'll be able to fight off the forces of evil and live to see another day. The only question is, how many casualties will that dark force leave in its wake? So this story, I'm a bit conflicted, to be honest. On one hand, I love the very traditional horror movie tropes that the game puts front and center in every single scene, and I really enjoyed how the story built up over the course of the 7 chapters that you'll end up playing through. From my perspective, this story is really nicely paced throughout the game, and I think Roberta Williams did a great job in making the stakes raise continually higher before peaking during the game's final deadly conclusion. There was definitely a degree of care given to the game's story, and it seems very much like something Sierra wanted to stylize as a Hollywood-like horror movie experience, which they mostly achieved. At the same time, nearly every single haunted house horror movie trope that you might expect is here, and none of them are particularly subtle. Phantasmagoria takes those horror movie staples and bashes you over the head with them, and in the process loses some of the effectiveness that more nuanced but still really scary Hollywood films can employ. Phantasmagoria is very much a Hollywood-like and Hollywood-light kind of production, which isn't to say it's bad, it's just not at the same level of quality as what I believe Sierra wanted to achieve. That being said, the story itself is fine, despite not being anything more than a traditional, if somewhat heavy-handed approach to horror. The delivery of that story, however, is a bit of a mixed bag, and here I'm talking specifically about the acting in the game. Oh, FMV games. How I love the wide variety of acting styles and quality that you get when playing these amazing interactive experiences. Phantasmagoria's acting runs the gamut from pretty solid performances like the lead actress Victoria Morcell to fun and ridiculous levels of B-movie campiness like lead actor David Holmes' portrayal of Don, to somewhat offensive, if not entirely too over-the-top characters like Harriet and Cyrus, who would have both earned Razzies if Phantasmagoria were ever released as a true film. The acting in the game is perhaps the least consistent part of the entire experience, because there's such a wide gap between the best and worst performances that, honestly, it can become a bit comical at times. I do have to give Victoria Morcell a lot of credit for her work here, because I thought her performance was legitimately good, and I have to give a virtual shake of the hand to David Holm, who goes so far over the top with his portrayal of Don, especially at the end of the game, that it's difficult to reconcile the fact that he was a real person, providing a real performance in a real recorded sequence. That final sequence, by the way, David Holmes' performance was so over the top that he ended up being more cartoon-like than any of LucasArts' cartoon-inspired adventure games. It was, to put it mildly, something to behold. And, lest you think I'm being mean, I actually loved his performance and thought the level of camp was simply awesome to experience. It wasn't quote-unquote good acting, but it was fun acting, and I've got to give him credit for that. Now, before we move on, I do need to talk a bit about the more mature themes that are included in the game, most prominently those depicting domestic abuse and rape. Over the years, I've had varying opinions about whether the inclusion of those scenes, and particularly the rape scene in the middle of the game, were truly necessary to advance the plot of the experience. For a long time, I maintained that as an interactive film more than an adventure game, and as a plot device, the rape scene, while not absolutely necessary, did in fact serve the purpose Roberta Williams wanted it to serve, which was to show just how far Don's character had fallen, and how much he was no longer himself. And while I still believe that that particular scene isn't dramatically different from similar scenes included in any number of lauded films, and is in fact less graphic than many movie depictions of similar violence, during my latest playthrough, I did begin to change my perspective here a bit. Playing through it again for this episode, I did actually begin to see how this scene might be considered more sensational than required, and I admit that it's entirely possible that it was added to the game for the controversy rather than to enhance the game's narrative. In this particular instance, I think nuance, subtlety, and perhaps a bit of a things are scarier if you don't see it approach would have been better than the scene that we got in the game. I'm still not going to vilify the game or Roberta Williams for its inclusion, but I do believe there might have been a better way to depict Don's downfall than how it was handled here. Anyway, overall, I did enjoy the story throughout Phantasmagoria, and the good definitely outweighed the bad. Was it the most nuanced narrative out there? No, I'm pretty sure that this particular story doesn't know what nuance means. But as a fun, campy, over-the-top experience, there's a lot to like and enjoy here. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked extensively about the game's playability and controls, including the fact that Phantasmagoria is 100% more of an interactive film than it is an adventure game. And honestly, there's not a ton more to say about it. If you come into the experience expecting a deep adventure game similar to Sierra's other titles, you're probably going to leave disappointed, as the gameplay, puzzles, and dialogue systems are far too bare bones to make for an engaging point-and-click adventure experience. If, however, you come in looking for a fun, campy, interactive film that could have only been made as an experiment in mid-90s FMV gaming, then you're probably going to have a good time, and might even, like me, have the game become a guilty pleasure that you fire up every few years, just to have a lightweight, several-hour horror experience that requires next to no long-term commitment. For B-movie styled entertainment, you can't really ask for much more than that. So what is our verdict on Phantasmagoria? Well, Phantasmagoria is an example of a game whose ranking will vary wildly based on what you assume the game to be when you first start playing it. Like we've talked about, Phantasmagoria is not a great adventure game, but I do believe that it is a fairly well-produced interactive movie with some very light adventure game elements thrown in for good measure. In fact, if you look at it from that perspective, then it becomes one of the more interactive movies out there, and it is that perspective that I personally feel is the right way of looking at Phantasmagoria. And it is that perspective that provides the rationale for why Phantasmagoria has just become the newest addition to our list of golden oldies. It is not something that you absolutely must play, and if you personally prefer deep adventure games over schlocky entertainment, then I'd probably steer clear of this one. But if you have even a passing interest in interactive movies, particularly those that utilize campy FMV acting from the mid-90s, then Phantasmagoria has got you covered. I don't see this one being considered by anyone to be one of the best games of all time, but honestly, it doesn't need to be in order to provide a fun experience, which is why Phantasmagoria is certainly deserving of its spot in our collection of golden oldies. That was our episode on Phantasmagoria. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be our Year 3 anniversary episode. It is the end of Year 3, which means it is time to rank all of the Pantheon entries from the past year. So we will go through and declare the top 10 Pantheon entries from Year 3 of the podcast. And just for everybody's awareness, our Pantheon for Year 3 is Command & Conquer, Biomotor Unitron, Goemon's Great Adventure, otherwise known as Mystical Ninja 2 starring Goemon, The Incredible Machine, Under a Killing Moon, Castle of Dr. Brain, Fallout, Baldur's Gate, Deja Vu, Sid Meier's Sim Golf, Pitfall, TIE Fighter, Sam and Max Hit the Road, Diablo, Leisure Suit Larry, Wipeout, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Myst, WWF No Mercy, The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap, Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers, Soul Calibur, and Sonic CD. So out of those Pantheon entries, we are going to declare the top 10 and go through each one. I'll explain why the ranking is what it is before we declare who is the ultimate Pantheon entrant for the last year. I am looking forward to that one. I hope all of you are too. At the same time, I would love to hear from everybody, especially if you're enjoying the podcast or even if there's some constructive feedback. To do that, and I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on ranking our Year 3 Pantheon entries. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.